All right. Welcome to Otherworldly Encounters with Mike and Brian. All right, Brian, what's today's topic, bud?
Well, I think before we even get into it, we got to take a moment. We shout out to all the moms out there. Mother's Day here. It's 71 degrees in Ohio. It's a beautiful day. Thanks for doing what you do. Uh, couldn't do any of it without them.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree 100%.
But that said, today's topic is a big one. The coup de grace, the biggest name in UFO lore. I think it's hard to talk about UFOs, UAPs without this dude, and that is Bob Lazar.
All right. Bob Lazar. All right. So, for those of you just, joining us, I am I wouldn't say necessarily a skeptic, right? But I am very inquisitive when it comes to UFOs. I want to believe, but I'm not necessarily there's just I need a compelling argument, right? Like, give me some evidence
Sure.
that we can research or whatever, and then I might fall in line.
You need something tangible, is what you're saying.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
right? Just give me something that I can
Yeah.
latch onto. But with that said, all right. So this guy we want to talk about, old Bob,
Yeah.
right? So
Mr. Lazar.
now, granted, I mean, he claims to work for the government, right, at Area 51. However, there's no record of that. Okay, so I'm just gonna get right into the I don't want to say bashing, but kind of like the negative stuff that are out there that I've researched and found, right? So supposedly went to MIT, negative, right? What else was there? He worked for that company?
Post MIT, one of the things he said he did is work for Los Alamos Labs.
Okay, and then that was debunked-ish, right? But we'll get into that, right? Because there was something that said that maybe he actually was there, right? But knowing how our government works, I also realize that shit can just come up missing, right? Like, so he very well could have went to MIT and worked at that Area 51 lab and stuff like that, right? But it's just...
I think what makes Bob's claim so interesting is that, one, if you think about a physicist, which is what Bob says he is, the quintessential physicist in my mind is this scrawny, super nerdy dude with, bottle bottom glasses, right? And that is Bob Lazar to a T. And the other thing I'll say about Bob is when you hear the guy talk, there is no question there is some education there. He knows what he's talking about in the chemistry side and the nuclear physics side. No question. The dude strapped a jet engine to his Honda, and that's how he got fame in New Mexico in the first place. So no question the guy can do some stuff. Where it gets a little questionable is when he comes into the claims, according to Bob, hey, long story made short, I helped reverse engineer UFOs. And so the question becomes, how do you take somebody who's this physicist nerd and get them working on UFOs? And the between those 2 points is the Bob Lazar story, and that's where all the debate comes from. Is he telling the truth, or is Bob full of shit? And there's a little bit of evidence both ways, and that's where we're going to go today.
All right, excellent. Well, let's get into it. All right, so won't you just hit us off with some, for all of our listeners out there who may not know who Bob Lazar is, just kind of take us back to, some of his history, right? And then, take us right into, his claim of Area 51 and reverse engineering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so according to Bob, and this is kind of in a nutshell, this isn't all the details. And one thing I will say about everything I've seen about Bob Lazar, Bob is a stickler for the details. Bob's been telling this story since 1989, and he won't go into things that he questions because he's been beat up over it pretty heavy. But from my understanding, Bob attended MIT and then Caltech for his scholastic background. And I believe one degree was in physics and the other in electronics. Bob then went on, and this is kind of where his story starts. Bob went on for his actual occupation. Bob went and worked for Los Alamos in New Mexico. And Los Alamos is famous for working on weapons for the military. I mean, that is a primary output of that laboratory. And Bob, there's a lot of hearsay about did Bob work there, did Bob not? One of the things that Bob did, and this was, I want to say maybe I don't remember if it was before COVID or after, Bob did the Joe Rogan podcast. And Bob said that he had went to Los Alamos because he was being debunked that he had ever went there. Similar with MIT and Caltech, and Bob
Right.
found an actual phone directory, a physical copy, with his name still in it. So part of what makes Bob's story hard is a lot of the things that Bob claims is not something that is trackable. And so kind of like what you were talking about with, give me the tangible evidence, right? Like part of trust is being credible. And so the question is Bob credible? Well, here's a phone directory with his name, but at the same time, there's no electronic records of him being there. So what do you believe there?
Right. I guess it comes out like, okay, so probably back when he went to, college or even at, you say West Alamos?
Los Alamos.
Los Alamos it was probably way before computers, right? Or at least where computers were maybe popular in the workplace as they are today, right? So in that regard, it would be easier to discard documents or any type of record that he did go
Right.
there or work there, right?
Right.
So for me, that part's not really like super suspicious because, again, with the right amount of money, shit can disappear, right?
Sure.
Like we could disappear tomorrow after talking about this podcast, right?
Sure.
Without a doubt. So that part to me is like, okay, well, now does it make me like, oh yeah, he's legit? No, it just makes me think that maybe his claim, there is some substance to his claims, right? So why is somebody going through so much effort if his claims may or may not be true, right? Like if they weren't true, why would they go through all the rigmarole to just get rid of something?
I think it's interesting. One of the theories that I've heard, and it's kind of interesting to think about because in my mind, I want to be like, why would you not want to publicize the study of UFOs? You would get the top tier researchers in the world. It's groundbreaking stuff working on it. Well, the thing of it is, the flip side of that coin is if you're trying to protect your airspace for your country, and if I, as the government, said, hey, there are these things flying around, we kind of know they're there, but we can't shoot them down, and we have no ability to protect you from them, it's a bad story when you're funneling a bunch of money towards that in terms of taxes. So if I wanted to discredit somebody, what I would do is get elite level thinkers to pull them off the street and say, hey, your education history is a little questionable. The output that I've seen, in Bob's case, jet engine on a Honda, let me put you in this program where you can work with the top of the top tech. The only caveat is that you can't publish on it, but since you have questionable scholastic.
But even if, okay, so let's say that he has a sketchy schooling background, right?
Yeah.
But if you were the government, which we're going to say is the government that is, needed to do this research, it's not just some Joe Schmo in a shed back, behind his house, right? There's got to be some credibility with his education, or you wouldn't have saw him out anyway, right? Like, I mean, how many YouTube videos have you watched? Some, schmuck is out in his garage and he builds a jet engine that he just watched somebody do on a YouTube video himself, right? So that's what I'm saying. Like, I don't know, man. I get what you're saying, but it's like, eh.
Bob's thing, he always said that is Los Alamos is a technical laboratory. What technical laboratory is going to hire somebody with a high school education?
Exactly.
Okay, fair.
No, I agree with that. That's legit.
And I think before we even get into Bob's stuff, one of the other components of this that I think is interesting is that Bob worked for a company post Los Alamos when he was working on the UFO stuff called EG&G, which is a government defense contractor. And one of the interesting questions when you get into like a FOIA request, which stands for Freedom of Information Act request, anything that's been made public can be requested and reviewed by the public. What's interesting is those FOIA requests have a limit, and that limit is once you get into government contractors. So if the U.S. government had a primary contractor like a Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman, doing the reverse engineering of these UAPs on their behalf, that FOIA really couldn't get down to that level. So if you were going to blacklist and make something super secret, that would be a great way to do it.
Right. Yeah, and that's probably why the government actually uses some, contractors for a lot of different things. One's, expensive to have a whole bunch of federal employees, but also that it's not a government facility, right? It's just it's a contract. So
background, we're not going to worry about it. We need you to reverse engineer this system we're going to show you. So let's continue on with the Bob story. So Bob is employed at Los Alamos, and Bob had the week. This is all going to be chronological here. The week that Bob made the school newspaper was the week that Bob strapped the jet engine on the back of his Honda. And the school newspaper was something like Crazy Physicist Straps Jet Engine to Car. And Bob was on campus that day to see a presentation by Edward Teller, who Edward Teller, if you don't know, he's kind of known as the father of the hydrogen bomb. And Bob thought it was really interesting, and it just so happened he went up to talk to him. Edward Teller was reading the school newspaper, saw it was Bob, recognized him. They struck up a conversation. Bob went to this talk that Edward Teller was giving. It wasn't well attended, and so went on the day, and Bob didn't really think anything of it until he got a call from a recruiter saying that Edward Teller had recommended him for this project, and it was a propulsion project for the military. So Bob agreed to it, and Bob was then assigned to an area called S4, which is, I believe, part of the greater Area 51 space. That could be incorrect. I've heard Bob be very specific with the location, but Area S4, which is close to, I don't remember if it's Papoose Lake or Groom Lake. I think it was Papoose Lake. But anyway, Bob went and signed some paperwork, did your normal sign up for work things, went to work the first week. And what was interesting is one of the briefings that he got was talking about reverse engineering of craft that had crashed, and Bob's kind of thought was, I'm reverse engineering some kind of more advanced fighter jet.
Like from Russia or China or something like that.
And it wasn't until, and I'm trying to remember exactly, because hearing Rogan ask the question, I thought it was really good. What was the first time that you thought that you were into something that you didn't expect to be into? And Bob said it was one of the first days when they went to go to the lab. There is a aircraft hangar door in kind of the side of this mountain. The whole base is carved into the mountain. And they walked in through the hangar doors to get to the lab, and there were all these quintessential shaped UFOs, like saucer-shaped UFOs. And Bob, even talking to Rogan, was like, I laughed to myself thinking, all this time people are like, UFOs, this is crazy, blah, blah, blah. And Bob's like, leave it to the U.S. government. They're making it, because when he walked by, there was a U.S. flag sticker on one of the craft. But then Bob got to the laboratory where he saw the propulsion system, and it was at that point that he was like, okay, this is something that doesn't exist yet. And it was an anti-gravity reactor. And his lab partner, who he names Barry, had been there a while, and it's from hearing Bob describe it, imagine like a pyramid with a basketball cut in half slapped on top of the pyramid. And to activate the system, you put the basketball on top of the pyramid. And so Barry does this, and he's like, go ahead, try to touch it. And Bob uses his hand, and he can't touch it because it's producing gravity pushing away from him, which doesn't exist. We can't do that today.
But then how do you get the basketball back off top of it?
You lift it. That's a good question.
Yeah.
Lift.
Yeah, see?
Okay.
See, here we go. See, now we're getting right into the part of it, right? It's like, so you have to start this pyramid thing with, like, let's just say a half basketball as we're talking about it, right? But then he goes to touch it, but you can't touch it, so it's always on, right? So, like, there we go. Like, that's the first big, like, question now.
Let me make sure I'm not full of shit when I say that, too. I feel like that's what he said. There was something that you said on top of something, and that turned it on.
But regardless, whether it's a basketball or something else, if you can't touch it, then how are you going to get it back off to turn it off?
There you go. So maybe it wasn't a pyramid. It's half a basketball on a plate.
Okay. But again, you touch it to turn it on, but you can't touch it to turn it off.
Yeah, fair point.
There must be like a three-way switch somewhere, right? It's like you got to turn it on.
Well, there were no switches. The way he described the interior of the craft was it was all like a copper manganese color, but he said there were no seams anywhere and no right edges. The only distinguishable features that you could tell were chairs, 3 chairs around this anti-gravity propulsion system, and then there was like a door that was honeycomb in shape that you could push and it would fold. And he said outside of that, nothing looked like anything he had seen.
That is, I'm trying to picture that in my mind, right? Like, so you're sitting there and you're like, was it like, if there was no seams, either they've just got like welding down to like a further science than we do currently to not have any seams whatsoever, right? But, or is it just like one big stamped, like?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So Bob, one of the things he had said is when he ran his hand on the outside of the craft, and they scolded him for touching it when he was walking through the hangar, he said it was cold to the touch. So he wasn't sure if it was a metal or a ceramic, but his description of the craft was like, in today's world, if you 3D printed something, right, it's all liquid and done from bottom to top, and then there's no seams or anything. It's just like it was formed out of wax. And he said that's what it was like inside, but he wasn't sure if it was a metal or a ceramic.
No, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something to think about.
Yeah. So Bob starts working on this reactor. And their whole goal, their singular project is to reverse engineer this reactor. We want to know how this thing works. And Bob's description is very unique, and it stuck with me, and it makes a ton of sense. He was like, here we have this reactor producing this enormous amount of energy with a fuel source that's element 115, which back in 1985 when Bob was doing this didn't exist. It didn't exist on the periodic chart yet. So let's try to reverse engineer this thing. And Bob's description was this thing could output so much power that it was like it was magic. He was like, there's no wires, there are no switches. You just put this device together and then it just turns on and goes. And he was like, his analogy, and I thought it was a good one, if we took a portable mini nuclear reactor and dropped it off in a Victorian home, it would power the home and it could power the entire town. No one would have any idea how it worked because the science wasn't there. And what we would do is what humans do, which is we take it apart and try to figure out how this thing works. Little would they know about radiation poisoning, and everyone that walked in the room after the reactor shield had been taken down would die instantly. But without science, so Bob was like, it was incredibly exciting, but incredibly scary because we really didn't know what we were working on.
It's like that red button that says do not press, right?
Right.
Like, that's what I'm hearing right now. Like, everyone's staring at it.
Yeah.
And they're like, we're pressing the button.
Yeah.
Like, but there's like, I'm not pressing the button. I'm going to hire these 2 fools or just one guy to go up and press the button for me because I don't know what it's about to do.
So here's one hole, and I won't call it a hole, but I'll call it interesting. So Bob was designated to solely work on the propulsion system. No other part of the craft. He was in the craft one time to see where the propulsion system existed. Bob's description was every aspect of the craft had its own investigation team. So you had a material science team that was examining, was this ceramic, was this metal? You had a navigation team that was trying to determine how this thing moved through space. You had a pilot team who was trying to understand how the craft, like everyone was segregated into different groups. And Bob's comment was, this is the worst possible way to do science because in order to be successful, you have to be collaborative. Oh, you learned something about the navigation system. Maybe I can connect that to the propulsion. But Bob said that they would report out to a person and then they were unallowed to work with any of the other teams.
So what you just said tells me this is definitely government funded because the government has a tendency of siloing certain things, right? Because everything's on a need to know.
Yeah.
So if you're working on propulsion and I'm working on navigation,
right,
you and I will never ever talk unless it gets to a point where I'm stuck. Like now it's bringing in propulsion or navigation or vice versa,
Yeah.
right? So now we can talk, but we can only talk about that. We can't talk about anything prior, like anything that I found or anything you found. We can't talk about that because I don't need to know it. All I need to know is, what do you know about this specific thing that now our wires are crossed?
So, I see, and that's interesting, and that makes perfect sense to me. Continue, and let's keep walking through the Bob Lazar story because from here out it gets kind of interesting. So Bob works on this project for quite a while, and he finally gets to the point where they're doing a test flight, and his lab manager comes in and says, "Hey Bob, they're doing a test flight of the craft. I'd like you to come see it to see if you can learn anything." And Bob said they walked outside, and the thing picked up off the ground. There was a human being in it, controlling it in whatever capacity. It lifted up off the ground. It was very wobbly, close to the ground, but once it got about 20 feet up, it was stable. And Bob said there were a couple interesting things that he observed based on what he had researched when he was working on this propulsion system. One was the way that the propulsion system worked. There's a little tiny antenna out of the top of this UFO, and Bob's description was this anti-gravity propulsion system created a wave and created something that kind of looked like the shape of a heart around the craft, and basically was like a planet moving through space. It was producing its own gravity. So think of like legit bulletproof, like you're the Star Trek Enterprise. You literally have a force field that's pushing away. The other thing he said was interesting is they were communicating with the pilot via a VHF radio, which he said should have been impossible with the craft producing its own gravity field. Like it would have bent the wave away and not allowed it into the craft. He said the craft went up, it flew around a little bit, and then came right back down. That was the only thing that he'd seen. So he saw the craft fly. One of the other things he learned is that Wednesdays were high-speed maneuverability nights. And I should look it up. I forget if it's Groom Lake or Papoose Lake, whichever lake. Bob went out to watch it from the desert because the base is located in a desert. Bob goes out, watches this thing. It darts all around the sky, and he's like, man, this is pretty cool. Bob is, at the time he's working at the base, he's married, but the way that his schedule worked with this S4 EG&G facility was they would call him on like a Saturday and say, you need to be at the airport at 11 p.m., you'll be here for 5 days or whatever it was. And he's married, but not allowed to tell his wife anything about what he's doing. So his wife ends up having an affair. Bob doesn't know about this. Bob's giddy because of the high-speed maneuvers with the UFO, so he invites his friends out to the desert. And this is the most believable part of Bob's story to me because I feel like I could relate to this. If I'm the guy working on UFOs and I know they're doing high-speed maneuverabilities, I do what Bob does, which is I take my RV and a case of beer and I take all my buddies out with me and I'm like, hey, dudes, I told you I'm not full of shit. Look at this.
Right. Yeah, I mean, yeah, of course, that's what you're going to do. Like,
yeah.
So now you got some people to collaborate what you're saying. However, that had to have gotten him into some trouble.
So Bob got massive trouble.
Okay.
So Bob is out there with his friends. The camcorder video of this still exists, but keep in mind this is like 1986. So imagine like a white dot on a screen zigzagging around. It's not great. But Bob said that they were being surveilled the entire time they were there, and the reason that they found out is one of the guys dropped their night vision scope, and then they busted Bob and his friends. Bob gets immediately kicked off the base, but then his lab manager had said, you don't know what you've done. Your life is over. Bob goes home. They tell him about the affair. His life kind of goes into shambles. And so to protect himself, Bob reaches out to George Knapp, who is a Las Vegas reporter, and says, I want to tell my story in case something happens to me. And that kind of brings us up to present day. Not present day. There have been a lot of things that have happened since, but of the Bob Lazar story, that's kind of it in a nutshell.
But the when he went to the press, he did that like incognito, right? Like he wasn't like they didn't know you could use the alias,
he was blurred out,
right? Yeah, or whatever, right? So, I mean, I think there just with if you're truly wanting to come forth, your life is already ruined, right? Mm-hmm. Why not go all the way, man? Like, why not just like, you know what, fuck it. Let's just get out there and you know, show my face and let's try to do some credibility to it.
And Bob's interesting. So Bob owns it's basically a chemistry supply store. And I forget what it's called. I've been on it a couple times, but it basically sells different generic chemistry stuff and like chemistry sets for kids. And then here's some Area 51 collectibles. But Bob's business has been raided by the FBI a couple of times, and according to Bob, so have some of his friends. Apparently tax audits. None of this I can corroborate. This is just from Bob, so I don't know if the research has been done. That's one of the things that has happened, and I feel like there's one other significant thing that happened to him outside of all the tax raids.
Well, I mean, you're on the radar at this point.
I remember this. This actually does not help Bob at all. I think it was 1990. Bob got indicted for his involvement in a prostitution ring sting.
Nice.
Yeah. Just a horny physicist, man.
Nice.
You know what? You're trying to make UFOs fly. You got to get out there and get after it, I guess.
Yeah, man, you got to go out there and chase the tail, right? I mean, you're chasing UFOs. You might as well
Chase it all.
Wow. Well, I mean, but then again, all right. So just because you got tied up in a prostitution ring, right?
Sure.
I mean, there's been a lot of heavy hitters, in the, whether it's movies, government,
Trump
whatever.
and Stormy Daniels is the most recent example.
Well, there you go, right? So, but it's like, so that doesn't really like make me like discredit the guy. I'm just thinking like, fuck it, man. You just, to your point, I'm a physicist, right? Like, and to be honest with you, most sciencey people I've talked to are pretty.
Yeah.
So
Bob fits the stereotype.
Yeah, I mean, he's not going to be getting on a dating app, and people are going to like swipe right or left, whatever it is, and they're going to talk to him. They're like, no. It's like watching paint dry, right? He's just kind of got that persona to him, from what I'm gathering here.
So let's get into what makes Bob credible. And we're going to start with Element 115. So Bob comes out with this interview with George Knapp in 1989. And one of the things that Bob had said that we've already talked about is that this anti-gravity reactor is powered by a stable version of Element 115. Element 115 didn't exist in 1989. Element 115 was discovered in 2003. And even when it was discovered in 2003, it was discovered as an unstable isotope, meaning it was put together in that hadron collider or whatever it is, that mile loop thing.
Yeah,
and it's existed for a millisecond and then it's gone. And Bob's claim was, that's what this stuff was powered by. But he was talking about something that didn't exist at the time he was saying it. So that's one piece. And then the other piece that was interesting is Bob has said since 89, when he would observe the high-speed test maneuvers, that when the craft would go into high-speed mode, typically you would think about something flying aerodynamically. So if we're talking about a saucer, the saucer would be flat and flying through the air vertically. What Bob said is that the saucer would go kind of perpendicular to the ground, where it would be completely unaerodynamic, and then it would take off. And that's how it would go really fast.
So it would look more like a bullet going through the air then, right? If you think of it like a UFO, right? It's
like the wide body is going forward through the air, which would just create so much drag. The drag coefficient would be through the roof.
Right.
But if you're creating your own gravity field, it wouldn't matter. So that was one interesting thing. And Bob's point to why that took place was how the system worked, is that the gravity generator was in the center of the craft, but then there were 3 trash cans, for lack of a better term, because Bob used that, 3 trash cans in the bottom of the craft, and you would kind of move these trash cans into certain alignments, and that would put the craft in whatever speed, like high speed, low speed, whatever, what have you. So Bob says that this craft goes up on end. Interesting, there's no way to corroborate the evidence. Then David Fravor came forward in, I want to say maybe 2014. Captain David Fravor was a commander for an F-22 squadron and was doing maneuvers out in San Diego. And they took FLIR video, and it's pretty interesting. David Fravor didn't take it. The second squadron up took the video. But one of the things that he had said is that this craft, they were following it. And you can see in the video, they're following the craft, and then the craft starts to go, kind of like Bob said, into that high-speed maneuver position, and then it's gone.
Okay. Well, so now you have
So those are the two pieces of evidence: element 115 and flight characteristics.
right. So okay, but I mean, you're having, and I think I might have seen this video actually. You now have the military or an individual from the military. What branch? I don't remember if it's Air Force,
I believe,
or Navy. Okay. So they're out looking at, because it obviously hit our radar somewhere that there was a suspicious craft, right, flying out there. So they're going out to investigate it. So now they have it on video, recent video, right? This isn't back like early 1990 shoulder-mounted camcorder, grainy as shit video. I mean, this is right. So then they capture this thing. Now, if I remember right, like, didn't he have to leave though to go get fuel or something like that? And then he met back up with them, and that's why the other squadron actually videoed it. Or I thought there was something to where.
So his jet wasn't equipped with, and I don't know what the camera was. So the David Fravor, and I forget, it was a woman who was flying the other jet. They were out doing whatever maneuvers, but the call came in, hey, we keep seeing something on radar going from 80,000 to sea level. Oh, will you go investigate? And they see this. They called it a tic-tac, going down to sea level and working on whatever at sea level and then popping back up. But they followed it. He went into like a corkscrew pattern. The thing mimicked him. And then it went to his next waypoint, which was, I don't know, like 60 miles away instantaneously, like within a second. At that point, they were running low on fuel, so they went back and landed, but then they sent up a secondary squadron to go investigate. That squadron had whatever the camera was, and that was the jet that took the video.
Oh, okay. So this Tic Tac was mimicking all their, and they knew, and this Tic Tac knew exactly where the next waypoint was going to be.
David Fravor, out of all the things he said, his description's interesting. So he flies up on this thing. They've obviously got it on radar. And he said it was a perfect San Diego day, blue sky, calm seas. He's like, you can see in the distance, like white water. Like there was almost rocks at the surface of the water. And he said they flew over in that direction. He was like, it looked about like the size of a 737, like some kind of jet, but he couldn't tell the size, shape, or anything, just that it was at the surface. And this Tic Tac was dropping down to ocean level and doing bizarre maneuvers, flipping back and forth all over top of this thing. But once it realized that the jets were investigating it, it flew up and flew like a parallel with David Fravor. And one of the things Fravor was doing is he was doing the spiral pattern to go down closer to the ocean surface to see what this thing under the water was. But that was when the Tic Tac started mimicking his spiral down, just on the opposite side of the spiral, same speed. And he said where he didn't know what it was, or if it was a black operation. What he said is it would be weird for them to be doing maneuvers in a space without telling us that they were doing maneuvers and to keep us out. Mm-hmm. And he said what scared him was the point where his next waypoint in whatever that aircraft system was 60 miles away, and the Tic Tac instantly like warped over there, and then they saw it at the waypoint on their radar. And that was where he was like, and he's somebody, to his credibility, what's interesting is he's somebody that got scrambled out of San Diego on 9/11. So he was flying the skies, keeping the country, clean and upright. Mm-hmm. So tons of credibility. So I don't put anything against it. And there's video to corroborate. And again, to take a step back and going back to Bob said that's how these things operated. And here's the video to kind of back that up.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I mean, I'm picking up what you're putting down for sure. I guess the thing with, if you go back to the Navy or the Air Force, whichever the pilot he was with.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I have no reason to disbelieve what he's saying. And then also to your point, I mean, there's a damn video, right? So now you got the video, and it does align with what Bob was saying. So I can't necessarily I don't have an argument to be like, no, it's a bunch of BS. Maybe it's just coincidental, right? But that's a lot of coincidences to like start aligning, You know what I mean? So it's like, okay, well, maybe there is some legitness to this story.
Yeah. And
But hold on a second though. Like, think
Yeah.
about this, right? This is like quantum, like computer times 20 shit right here, right? Like breaking encryption. You have U.S. military plane with the most sophisticated electronics and encryption and whatever on them, right? And this Tic Tac, like, hacked your shit in less than like a millisecond.
right.
You know what I mean? Like, that's like, if you think about that, whether you're a skeptic or not, like, this is getting into like prepper mode.
Well, and what's weird to me is like, okay, so let's just say for a minute that these are extraterrestrials, whether they're from Earth or some other planet. Like, who knows what they look like? Who knows what they speak? Who knows what their intentions are? We don't know any of those things. What's kind of wild to my mind, if I accept that what David Fravor said is accurate, how does this organism, this extraterrestrial, have the ability to your point, hack a computer system, but then to interpret the data that the computer system's putting out? Like, do they even use GPS? How do they know that what's in that system is something that they can corroborate into? Oh, I know exactly where this is out in space.
Yeah, no, it's it's interesting. Like, it kind of blows your mind a little bit because you sit there and thinking about it, and you're like, oh well, I've got a comment, and then you're like, pause. Do I really have a comment? Because this is actually like potentially making some sense here.
So I think, for Bob Lazar, I think those are the two main things: the flight characteristics, element 115, and then, to Bob's credit, the exact same story since 1989. Yes, you can blow holes in his academic record, but if his story is true, in my mind, and this is a giant government cover-up through EG&G or Northrop Grumman or whomever, then Bob seems like the easiest character to wipe out of the books because of the divorce situation with his wife, this prostitution ring, and then getting rid of your academic records. But there's no denying, and Bob has the newspaper, the dude put a jet engine on a Honda. So does that make him an astrophysicist or, whatever? No, I don't think so. But, man, when you listen to the guy talk, it's hard to say he has not studied science to a high level.
Yeah, and again, like we were talking about earlier, strapping the jet engine to the car, right? Now, this is back in was it 80s or 90s?
Yeah.
Right? Obviously, there's no, hey, let's put the VCR tape, in and
Right.
try to find that one spot that talks about how to build
not
your
YouTubing
own rocket engine, right? So I mean,
Right.
this is something that he would have either had to like study it himself, going and just grabbing all those books out of the library and just putting in the hours to make it,
Right.
or he's just that effing smart to where he can just like, you know what, fuck it, I'm gonna build a rocket engine today, and he just does it.
Yeah.
So I get the like, he's obviously a smart guy.
Obviously a smart dude. And I don't want to talk to it because I don't remember. So Jeremy Corbell did a documentary on Bob called Area 51, Bob Lazar and Flying Saucers. And it was a more modern day look at who Bob Lazar is and then the telling of the Bob Lazar story. One of the things I thought was interesting, and this is what I didn't want to talk about because I don't remember what it was, Bob had built some kind of scientific device that, to the layman like myself, looked like a giant telescope coming in from the side of his house, but I think it was like a proton accelerator or something that I didn't really have familiarity with, but Jeremy has photos of what this thing is. Like, Bob's house is kind of house, but also kind of like, again, that like stereotypical nerdy physicist guy. Like, it's exactly what I would expect. Like, everything's 1970s wood panel, and then here's like my chemistry set tucked in like a majority of the house. Like,
And everybody's couch is like that brown with the cabins, right?
100%.
Yeah,
100%.
okay.
So I'm like, the dude looks the part. There's certainly a lot of holes that you can blow in it, but man, just as time goes on, everything that we've seen and everything that's been talked about seems to give a little more credence. And actually, there's one piece of evidence that I didn't talk about that also recently came forth, and I think this was a Rogan find for myself. One of the things Bob had said is in order to get into Area S4, there's a handprint reader, but it wasn't a handprint. It actually scanned the bones within your hand because
no shit.
all of your bone structures
Mhm.
unique to you.
Right.
That didn't exist until somebody had found that it did exist in like 2018. And you put your palm on this reader and it reads your bones in whatever manner and then grants you access instead of like a fingerprint or eye identification. So
Nice.
it's another piece of like tech that Bob has talked about. And then, yeah, here we are 20 some years later. Well, actually more than 20. And it seems legit. So
The sad thing about this, all right, so let's just say everything that he said is true, right? Even if the government were to come out today and say, hey, this is actually what's happened, he would never, ever get the credibility.
no.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, he would never get the credit. He would still be that guy. I don't know if because they scandalized him, right? They made him look like a turd.
Well, and one of the things Bob has said, and it's interesting, and here's let's poke holes in this story for a minute. One of the things that I can't help but wonder, if I'm Barry, who worked with Bob in the lab, and Bob comes out and says, here's my story. If I'm Barry, this has to just eat you up inside. Like, I want to tell the world about what I'm working on because it's elite technology that shouldn't exist. If I see Bob come out, it's hard for me to believe that not one other person wasn't like, you know what, I think Bob's right. Let me take a step outside of the boundary zone here and say, corroborate what Bob is saying. But no one did that. Bob will argue that they didn't do that because he was just torn down as a human being from the federal government, and they saw
100%.
that and then backed out and were like,
100%.
I don't want to talk about it. So
100%.
but there's power in numbers too, right? So I would think, and again, to your point, and I guess now that I'm kind of contradicting myself now that I think about it, if you do compartmentalize groups, Bob's only friend was Barry and then the guy that they reported to. So Bob would have really only had one other person that could have come forward. And what would be interesting to know is what's Barry's background? Like, would Bob have known what schools Barry went to, and could we have corroborated that evidence somehow, similar to what they did with Bob at MIT and Caltech?
Put it this way, Barry either died of natural causes or he died after the day after Bob came forward.
Right.
All right. So like they want to get rid of loose ends.
Right.
And loose ends, and maybe that's why he never came forward, is because he's not around anymore.
Right.
I mean, you think about that shit, right? Like, how many times have you seen, let's throw in Epstein, right? Guy just gets killed in a max prison facility, right? With
Oh,
cameras.
he doesn't get killed. He kills himself.
Well, right.
Allegedly.
Yeah, he allegedly hung himself, right? So you can't tell me
Right.
that these people aren't just like, oh, I'm raising my hand,
Right.
right? I'm taking, I saw everything, right?
Right.
Ain't gonna happen.
Right.
Nothing to happen.
Right.
So I agree with that part.
So I mean, that's kind of the entirety of the story. So, Mike, I'm curious. You're kind of the outsider in the alien world, and I like to throw the story at you and get your take on, the pros and cons and where you think this may fall. So I'm curious to get your take. Where does Bob Lazar fall for you?
All right. Well, before we get into that, I do have a question, and this is for the listeners. So please, send us an email, whatever. I want to know, how do you prep for an alien invasion? Because there's people out there as preppers, right? So now we're talking about, and there's some stuff that you brought up that, to me, even as a skeptic, is like, yeah, all right, I can get behind that, because there's more evidence saying it is a sure thing than a negative thing. You see what I'm saying? So if you got so how would you prep for an alien invasion?
Well, hold on. It brings up an interesting point. Let's say that would come about. Would the aliens be allies or are they enemies?
I don't think they're part of NATO.
So they're coming in hot to take our shit.
Well, I'm not saying they're going to come in hot, but I think that's what is scary about it, right? Okay, think about this. there had to been some type of discussion amongst alien. Okay, put it this way: if aliens actually did exist, they obviously, it's been proven what you're just talking about with the military pilot and the thing being able to go to its next checkpoint,
Right.
hacking in. Dude, they could wipe us out at any point.
Right.
Like, if it was legit, they could wipe us out. No questions asked. So,
Why haven't they?
exactly, right? Now that's to me the deeper story of this is like, if Bob's story is true, which you asked me where my stance is, I'm right there. Like, there's part of me is like, yeah, man, I can get behind this. But the skeptic side of me is, but I will say I am more towards the, yeah, I can believe what some of this stuff, what this is. That I'm leaning that way, right? But the skeptic in me is always, because, I mean, if anybody out there has other information that they would like to share, right? Like to dispute, like for me, my thoughts, right? Because obviously you have a strong belief, in what he has to say, right? Me, I don't. So I don't have any. I mean, I have really no skin in the game, other than it's a very interesting topic to discuss and listen to, right? Because I'm even like, God damn, man, this is pretty sweet. Especially now that like it happened. Like, all right, if this would have happened in like the late 2000s and this dude came forward, I don't think he would have had the heat that he had back in the 80s or 90s when he came forward.
Well, the other thing too that would have been interesting is he wouldn't have had a 1984 camcorder, VHS camcorder to record these high-speed maneuvers. He would have had an iPhone that maybe could have given some real definitive evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think it would be a game changer if it was being more modern than,
Well, listen, everybody's got a personal computer in their pocket now. So if you're ever out and about and you see something, take a photo, take a video, and make sure you send it to us so we can talk about it.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. That would be the cat's meow right there, right?
Yeah.
Let's get some
Absolutely.
listeners' videos or listeners even emails, man. Like, tell us about your experiences. Like, have you seen anything? Do you think you saw something? Right? Like, describe it. If you have video, obviously
We're looking for tangible evidence.
Yeah.
Ideally, you just send us a video and let us know you have a body, and we can come do a DNA sample. Right, that would be the best case scenario. But we'll take some videos. We'll take some audio too if you got that.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. And then if you have questions, comments, whatever, feel free.
Right.
Hit our DMs.
So, Mike, are we pro Bob Lazar or are we against Bob Lazar?
Again, man, I can't say I'm definitely not against him.
Okay.
I'm leaning more towards the pro, but that's why I was just saying, like, send us some stuff, like send me some stuff that we can talk about. Like, I can sit here and discuss with you, like, well, here are the cons, right, to this topic. Mm-hmm. So it might be something that, like, right now, like I say, I'm leaning towards them. Mm-hmm. But there could be something comes in that might start tilting me back towards the middle. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally get it. And to take a step back to your last question, I think the answer is if we follow the advice from the movie Signs, what you do is what my wife likes to do, which is leave a bunch of half-empty glasses of water all over the house. So if aliens come in, you can, knock the water on them, which is like acid to the alien. It's my home defense mechanism for it, should the invasion occur.
Okay, so now
I also have a fridge full of garage beer, so I'll be right there too.
Okay, so 2 points here. One, garage beer is amazing, and this is not
the brand. I just meant garage beer.
Oh, okay, no, I'm talking about the actual brand. Now, we're not endorsed by any stretch of imagination, but I will tell you, if you want a great beer, just sit with your dudes or your ladies out in a barn and just fucking crack one, get a garage beer. They are amazing. My top choice.
You think Bob Lazar drinks beers?
He seems like a gin guy.
I could see that. Gin and tonic?
No, just straight gin.
Oh.
I mean, he likes the pine tree. Like, he's just like that pine. Like, that's what I see him. I see him just like kick back in his 1970s recliner that matches the couch. All right. Like the same log cabin pattern. You know what I'm talking about.
I do.
The log cabin pattern.
You know what's weird about that? Think about this for a second, though. Bob loves hookers and propulsion systems. By default, he should probably love cocaine and just be living this ripping lifestyle. Maybe that's why he put the jet engine on the Honda.
Maybe he's like a fireball guy then.
I bet Bob would probably be a good time to hang out with and have a couple beers.
Absolutely. Agree 100%.
Yeah. Bob, if you're out there listening, we'd love to have you, call in, email, be a guest. And if you don't want to do any of those things, if nothing else, we'd love to just have a couple beers with you and talk it through.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be a good time. Because like I say, I'm not out here to bash anybody, but I will tell you if something's BS, and I don't think this is BS. Like I say, I'm leaning, man.
Yeah.
It's a compelling story. That's why we need people to steer us in other directions. That'd be a great topic. All right, everyone. I think that's going to be the end of this one. Until next time, I'm Mike.
And I'm Brian.